Rolling. What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy. Today, we're going to have a very special episode. But before we get into that, just want to go through the brief intro. If you are new to the podcast, we have rants where I'll go in and just have different hot topics that I see, call out maybe some BS in the industry that I see, or full-length interviews, which we have today, just going in with experts, athletes, and coaches, breaking down what helps them get in the zone or what their specialized zone is. And then also the mental minutes, those quick mental game hacks to help elevate your performance. And then deep dive educational explorations, which we'll actually get a little bit into in this interview today as well, of different parts of how guys return to throw. But before we get into it, Alan, appreciate you coming on, man. It's awesome to have you on here. I know a lot of people know of you, but obviously the Alan Jaeger is maybe something that's very, very unknown of how to pronounce that because the J bands are very well known, but appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, Garrison, man, thank you for having me and doing this. And what can I say, man? I'm looking forward to chatting.
Yes, sir. Love it. Well, obviously you guys recently put out, you and Randy Sullivan, who I've worked with for a few years in the past, and definitely look up to him and always love to hear what he has to say about things. But it's been a common trend, and I was a part of a lot of some of the discussions in Twitter or X threads now, I guess what you call it. Kind of the detriment of some of these return to throwing plans. But I kind of want to lay out a timeline, so to speak, right? Like, and I know Randy talked about this a lot, where it's like, hey, these first couple return to throwing plans were back whenever guys were still smoking cigarettes in the dugout, right? And they were still going out and didn't really have much of a plan. So they just were like, hey, here's this, regimented kind of more structured than just, hey, go out and throw and wait 12 months until you get back on the mound, so to speak. Right. And I think that's when roughly the Tommy John surgery first started up, which was almost called the Brent Strom surgery. So
Yeah,
him.
number two.
Shout out for him for that. But yeah, so I mean, and obviously you've been around baseball for quite a while and seeing all of this kind of develop. But kind of fast forwarding now, what have you seen change for the better, and how do you think we can kind of continue to progress into this? And obviously using the manual you guys just recently put out.
Yeah, well, number one, man, I didn't mention already, thank you for doing this and having me on. It's a really cool opportunity to talk about, the nuances of the game and really rehab is a nuance.
Sure.
I think the protocols have been around for essentially 50 years, but ironically, I did a lot of research on this because um, I was very, very frustrated with a lot of the major league organizations for many years that were pushing this 120-foot program that was mandatory. Um, and we had guys religiously in our camp for probably 15 years that were between, 280 and 360. And that was normal. And that's what they trained at. And so when they would go to spring training, which I went to for at least 20 straight years, I spent most of my time on the backfields. And on the backfields, I would watch these 120-foot timed incremental throwing programs being done. And I was so puzzled and frustrated. And the players were so frustrated and upset. Because as I said earlier, a lot of these were mandatory. The players had no choice. In fact, they were basically told, like, we know this is what's healthy for you, no matter what you did or what you believe in. It was really I hate to make it sound so blunt, but in a way it really was. Maybe not all the organizations, don't get me wrong. There were some organizations that were very liberal and open to long toss and what I like to call individuality, which to me is like really, really essential. But there were quite a few organizations where this was absolutely gospel to them. And it was like their way or the highway. And I mean, to the point of view where you could get suspended. And so long story short is that built up a immense amount of frustration and upset. And so I started to research where this 120-foot program came from. And ironically, about 2012, I wrote this extremely long article where I interviewed Dr. Yoakum in person. I interviewed Kevin Wilk at ASMI. I
Mm-hmm.
interviewed Stan Conte, who was the head medical services for the Dodgers and Giants. I interviewed Tom House. I interviewed a lot of people.
Yeah, big names for a lot of those research articles early on too, for sure.
Yeah, and because, subconsciously what I was really doing was I wanted them to prove my point that this 120-foot program, as I would soon find out, was really a rehab program. And I wanted them to get talk in terms of why this 120-foot program came into existence, because of the rehab mentality. And so because I dove so deeply into the source of this 120-foot program, knowing it eventually, or learning eventually came from rehab, well, then I became highly, highly sensitive to the rehab side of things, because now if we knew of any players that went through rehab, or any of my buddies' pitchers were going through rehab, we started seeing the same things, right? They would
Mhm.
do this, 5-month buildup to where, well, technically it might be more like 4, but whatever it is, they would get to 120 feet. I looked at the throwing, not only did I look at throwing programs for the healthy populations of these players, of course, I started looking at the throwing programs for the rehab. And not to my surprise, these programs capped also at 120 feet. And so that has always been in my cross, so to speak, for many, many years. And it wasn't until about 6 months ago that something happened that's I don't really want to get into, but
Fair enough.
just finally, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I it was based on a phone call. I reached out to Randy and I said, Randy, look, I can't take this anymore, that these kids across the country, across the world, are getting a printout of a throwing program of the top surgeons in the world that are putting out these throwing programs, which they all mean well. I know that. I know they mean well. I know the athletic trainers and PTs mean well. There's nothing against them, but they're putting out a program that essentially I've done the research on, has its roots from 1974. And and I'll kind of wind this up because I know this has been a little bit of a tangent, but
No, it's all
um,
great. I love the history behind it. It's awesome.
oh, cool. Yeah. Well, I've done so much research on this that I've found out things like from Will Carroll that Dr. Jobe himself, who if people listening to this aren't familiar with, Dr. Jobe, of course, did the first, well, of course, but he did the first Tommy John, and
Mhm.
Dodgers Doctor Forever, and is just as a pioneer. And one of the things he said to Will Carroll was that back in the day, one of the reasons why the number 120 feet came up is because in Vero Beach, where the Dodgers trained, where they had their rehab facility, the next closest building was about 120 feet away. And so they ran out of room. And that's when they would send them over to the quote unquote healthy side, to what I would assume resume training. It wasn't like 120 feet was the end of anything.
Right.
Uh,
Sure.
and I think everybody will agree in the medical community as well that 120 feet is pretty arbitrary. Like 100 pitches is a pitch count is arbitrary.
Mhm.
So to put this whole story to bed, I called Randy and I said, look, because these pitchers are getting capped at 120 feet, and look, if you're 12 years old and 120 feet was your distance pre-surgery, then that could work. Or if you're a major leaguer that doesn't want to go past 120 feet, I don't know if that's the case with a lot of them, but then that's their prerogative too. But the problem is that you might have 3/4 of your pitchers in your organization that are 250 to 380.
Sure. Yeah.
And so putting them on a 120-foot program, for me doesn't make any sense at all. So, and also I've gotten feedback over the years because I'm a hawk with this stuff. I ask questions, whether it's healthy arms, whether it's rehab, whether it's 5-day rotations, whether it's 7-day rotations, whether what's they're doing in Japan, what are you doing in the Dominican. I love to ask questions. I'm curious, and I would say my experience with players going through rehab has been almost universally the same.
Hmm.
They feel the integrity of the elbow is, let's call it, in relatively, good shape, but they don't feel strong. They know something's a little amiss, like they're not quite sure what it is. They don't feel quite ready,
Yeah.
even though they've had 10, 11 months. Um, their recovery doesn't seem to be as great. Their feel, which I know is something Randy has talked a lot about, their feel,
Oh,
because
sure.
you go out to 120 feet. And also, I think you tend to throw the ball on a line because you're not getting out that far. For us, that's a huge proprioception issue.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the catalyst. So I reached out to Randy and I said, let's just put something together. And 4 months later, I mean, it was 4 months of a ton of grinding and hard work. And we reached out to countless people to get their feedback. Ben Brewster's involved with the manual. Nolan Rapay's involved with the manual. I mean, we have 65 people in our coalition that to me are just some of the most respected, brilliant people out there in the
Absolutely.
baseball.
I loved how you mentioned all those guys too, because you're pulling from really the entire baseball industry, right? Like it's
Oh,
never just one person's idea, and we all do borrow from each other. Like it's definitely a thing, right? But just being able to reference that and being like, hey, like I don't remember where I got this from, but this is kind of the concept we're going with. And then you list all those guys with like one of these guys probably came up with it that I talked with, or who knows, right?
hey, you know what? There's power in numbers. And also, look, as much as I feel like I understand this and Randy understands it, we had someone like Ricky Meinhold, who's like one of the directors of pitching with Toronto now, who spent actually a lot of time in this area with the Mets in the rehab world and with measurables and stuff like that. Like I said, Ben Brewster gave us a very objective chart to work with.
Yeah, no, I love that chart too. Yeah, it's good to kind of,
Yeah, I mean, Scott,
again,
just
that individuality piece, like you talked about, you have to make it more specific to the person and not just a blanket, you know, oh, hey, everyone does this one size fits all throwing plan, right?
it's just a collection of people and we were able to put our egos aside and say, hey, let's just get this better. I was going to also mention, just from a conversation with Scott Brown, out of nowhere, he started talking about journaling.
Hmm.
And I hadn't thought of that. Randy hadn't thought of that. And we were both like, Shh, brilliant. And so we have a
Yeah,
section in there about journaling. We have a section in there about historical data, meaning we have a whole page, which is a write out of questions about what did you do pre-surgery? Because that's a massive piece as to how your plan should look moving forward. And I don't know if there's a lot of historic. I mean, I've looked at a lot of the top return to throwing programs, and maybe in actually the doctor's offices they go through the historical significance. I don't know if they do because if they already have a standardized program built out to 120 feet that looks, very standardized for everyone, I don't know if the historical significance really plays as much of a role. I would think it should, but
sure.
with them. But again, I don't want to speak on their behalf. I don't know for sure what they're doing or not doing. I can say this for sure. I have looked at the three arguably top return to throwing programs out there. And Randy and I felt like there was just this massive piece missing that I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, there definitely was a gap, and we all recognized it too. And some of it was just kind of like, hey, we gotta go in and change this, or we had our own maybe method that we got from other people. But like you said, there was a lot of environmental constraints when it first came around. They were limited to 120 feet, right? Or even early on, then it's like, hey, you don't know what you don't know. But I think it's definitely important to listen to the athlete, like you said, where they felt like, oh, I don't feel 100% prepared or ready or physically strong enough. And I think that's a big piece. Even like we were talking about being mentally in the zone. Like if you're on in the game and you're not fully convicted into this pitch that you're about to throw, it's probably not going to go well for you, right? So I think in that is immensely important for a rehab setting where as you're going through this process, if you're not 100% bought in on what you're doing, then that some of that uncertainty is going to show up in your day-to-day activities of when you're trying to get back to play.
And I would use another word. I love the word uncertainty. I would also use the word vulnerability.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love what you said too, because Garrison, part of the beauty of our program is we're empowering the athlete. We're allowing them to adapt
Yes. Yeah.
to their program. We're giving them space from 120 feet on for at least another 4-week period to where they can play and be athletic and work on volume and self-regulate. I mean, that's another crucial piece to empowering the athlete, is letting them self-regulate. And I feel like these 120-foot programs, a 93.5-mile-an-hour fastball, which is the average major league fastball as of at least a week ago,
Right. Yeah.
I think we'll go, according to Ben's chart, about somewhere between 330 and 360.
Hmm.
I mean, when you start looking at just the average velocity of a fastball at 35 degrees, how far it'll go, it just blows your mind in perspective at how short 120 feet actually is for we're talking about the best athletes in the world, or the best arms in the world, and the best arms in the world. So yeah, back to this whole idea of, as you said, it's a really important point that we have to adapt to the athletes, and we have to empower them. We have to let them figure out how to start to self-regulate, because that's what they did pre-surgery for the most part, right?
Absolutely. Oh yeah. They just kind of threw the field. They didn't have a specialized plan necessarily. They just were like, oh, hey, my arm feels good. We'll keep throwing. Or, my arm feels a little toasted. We'll maybe take today off or just to keep it light. And that's what I'm sure you probably even recommend to all the athletes that you've, had discussions with. Like, hey, listen to your body, listen to your arm, because that's what's really the biggest thing, and probably the biggest, um, guide as your what your body's capable or capable of that day, right?
Well, it's funny, is the single most important principle of our throwing program that we've been saying since the beginning, as long as I can remember, is listen to your arm.
That's it. And I've seen that on countless tweets and stuff like that, and just having that feel for that. It's kind of crazy to think about. Even as a coach, you constantly hear yourself saying, hey, how do you feel? How does this feel, right? And then they sometimes can be some athletes can get hyper aware of their feeling, but some of them completely gloss over it too. They're just like, you know what, this is what I have on my plan for today. We're just going to rip it and pay almost no attention to their body whatsoever. So obviously you got to find a middle ground there, um, and help guide them and make sure they don't become super neurotic, or end up being someone who just throws no matter what, even if they're throwing through pain or whatever is listed, they're just going to do it anyways, right? So
Well, that's the beauty of the coach. The coach's job is to help the player ultimately get in tune with their body, in tune with their mind, in tune with their arm, and yeah, it's a give and take, and you have to kind of massage it. But I just think it's the greatest gift you can give to a player, is for them to really understand how their body moves and their instincts move, how their instincts want them to move, and also to give them the freedom. I mean, one of the coolest things about long toss is that, and again, long toss, like anything else, is built up over a progression in time, but
mhm.
you take the restrictions away, you take the time allotment away, and you just let a player go out there and throw. I watched it for 20 something years on the field with players in our camps. It is mystical. I'll use the word mystical when you just watch an athlete sort of on their own just start to throw and figure out like how far to go out, as you said, and if it's a pull down day or not. But over the course of weeks in a camp, you just see this evolution where all of a sudden, we'll watch a player go out to 300 feet, come back in and throw for 20, 25 minutes, on flat ground, and just throw 70% changeups, because they can, because
Mhm.
they're like a BP pitcher that's built up. And I know that might freak out a lot of people to hear, but we've had I know in my own arm, even in my 50s, I could go out there and, no, I'm actually 60 now. I can go out there and maybe I won't go past 120, 150, 180. I'm not in shape, but I can tell you this, I can still probably throw a ball with medium effort at 60, 70 feet for an hour plus. And the next day, I won't be sore. And if I am, it will be a very nice, pleasant sore. Um, and so I just think that there's something magical, mystical about allowing the athlete to have the freedom to self-regulate, because I think contrary to a lot of what's going on right now, which I call risk aversion and other people call risk aversion, I think I have a tweet I put out the other day. It's something like, we're trying to protect these arms to be healthy, and we're protecting them from being healthy.
Right.
And
Sure.
and our philosophy is the opposite. We believe that the arm is extremely resilient. I'll use a great word from Randy that he talks about all the time, robust. We're trying to create robust, he talks about robust tissue, right? We're trying to create robust, durable, well-conditioned arms. And that comes from throwing more, not less. And of course, throwing more responsibly.
Mhm.
But anyway.
No, yeah, I 100% agree with that. And to your point, what you were saying is progressive overload of anything, whether it's physical training or even the long toss. Like, you don't want to go day one and just start maxing out long toss, and you got to have some feel for that. And I'm sure there's some horror stories out there that you may or may not have heard of. But I love the concept that you guys used, and I don't know who particularly came up with it, but you mentioned it a second ago, the massage throwing. And I was like, oh, I've never actually heard it phrased that way. But when you hear the word massage, it's like, oh yeah, like relaxing, versus, hey, just go play catch. That has a lot less nuance, or like the emphasis of the words that you use kind of gives you the tone of what that intensity should be for that day, right? And a massage throwing is just like, oh, okay, like we're just out here kind of lightly tossing. Like that's how I would kind of conceptualize that massage throwing, just from the phrase. Versus long toss, everybody has that same preconceived notion. Oh, long toss means long toss as far as you can and max it out every single time. And that's not necessarily true, right? Like, there's different other days, and for guys to actually learn how to self-regulate, depending on what they have for that day too, right? Or whatever time's allotted. Some guys, they get to games and they have a short amount of time. So they're like, hey, I can't get to 380. I have to maybe put a lot more on a line when I come back in. Or, you're a bullpen guy, couldn't stretch it out. So now you got to figure out another way to get the work in and prepare the tissue that you need to be that robust arm, right?
Yeah, well, I love the word massage because, like you said, it's very visceral. And also, I I got into yoga at an early age. I was actually getting massages at a very young age. First of all, I loved it. It felt good, but I think intuitively I knew it was really, really helpful for the body and the longevity of the body and the well-being of the body. And so I think at a very young age, I made the connection with throwing that you want freedom and range of motion before explosion. I think any muscle group, right? You want the freedom and the relaxation in the muscles, the warm up in the muscles, right? The blood flow before you go into high exert mode. I mean, I think that's just a given with anything. If you go out and run right now,
Hmm.
you're going to stretch your legs out first. You're going to probably do some warm up. You're going to jog. Then you might jog a little faster. Then you might light sprint, and then eventually you might sprint. It's the same thing. Randy calls it managing the delta, which he got from Dr. Marcus Elliott. And I think with massage throwing, the reason why I love that term so much is because I know that when I go out to throw, I want to massage my arm into the distance. And even when I could throw it 300 feet or more, the irony is that yes, I'm using effort. Yes, there's a part of me that feels like I'm getting aggressive, but my brain and body are still feeling a sense of freedom.
Hmm.
And I think that's the idea behind the word massage, is that you're not only throwing, and yes, I should say one other thing about massage throwing. We also use that term because when you first come out and throw, especially post rehab players, the tendency might be to be a little linear and to be anatomically a little rigid. And the analogy I use all the time is a quarterback throwing a screen pass, right? Just get it over the line. You have to have a little arc on it. But the other side of massage throwing is that we just want the athlete from the get-go to start to have a feeling of being loose and relaxed, and including the brain, and get some mark on the ball, because we want the arm to gradually open up prior again to the explosive throwing. So we want freedom before explosion. And even if you don't pull down that day, so to speak, we still want you to gradually open up the arm through freedom, through that range of motion. And what better way to do it than to think in terms of, oh, I'm just massaging my arm. And you can massage your arm at 300 feet. I've seen
Sure.
it.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
I've so yes, so I'm glad you picked up on that. And just for any, for people that are listening to this, it's in our manual, but it's actually on YouTube, and you could just YouTube um, massage throwing, whatever it is, Jaeger Sullivan throwing program, I think is how it's put. But you could just put Jaeger Sullivan massage throwing, and it's a 5-minute video on how to do the massage throwing. And so anyway, I'm glad you brought it up because it's actually a big deal.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because, I being and coaching a lot of guys, you have what kind of that, you know, I hate to use it in a political sense, but like left versus right side of like where they're at. One athlete could be totally over here where they're like, hey, I'm hypersensitive. And then the other one's like, I'm not sensitive at all to my body or how my arm feels, and we're just gonna grip it and rip it. And the fact that you even have that, and again, it all does start up here. It does start mentally. What their approach is going to be for that day will influence the output, right? So whatever they're putting in and whatever they know that, okay, hey, this is what I got to do for the day, is going to influence not only their warm up, like you mentioned, not only what they're going to do, because I mean, you can even see it in some guys when they know that they're going to throw at max effort, their body physically tenses up just from them knowing what they have to do for that day. Versus maybe you're like, hey, let's just play catch and then we'll see what happens from there. Then, some guys can just absolutely light it up a lot better without that predetermined idea of, oh, hey, we're maxing out today, right? Because I think a lot of these things, whether it's physical training or being in the game, whenever you're trying to hit your spot, you have coaches barking from the background and things like that, right? But it does start in the head, and a lot of guys that have, you know, whatever kind of uh poor pattern that you want to kind of throw out there. It's again different for every person's philosophy, but a lot of that I think also does start from where they get it from up here. Because if they're trying and they have this, you know, I was one of these guys, was the try hard kind of guy where it's always mentally there. That shows up in how they just are super herky jerky in a lot of their throws. And and it influences their progress that way versus being able to have that even just through normal day-to-day throwing. Like, don't be that guy that throws 100% at 30 feet for the first couple of throws. You got to ease into it, right?
Well, it's a brilliant observation on your part, because when you do know to massage throw, it just opens the door to possibilities that you may or may not know you have. And if you come out, as you said, with more of this higher intent mentality, or your arm is sort of not sure how it feels, you just might skip that piece and you might put yourself in a vulnerable position. But when you come out with massage throwing, it's like you open the door to all these incredible possibilities. You allow yourself to warm into a situation where all of a sudden you might have an epic day of throwing, just because you allowed your arm to warm up properly, and it was actually feeling fine. But if you don't do that, and it's a little tight and it's a little off, and you get a little aggressive and you're not aware to do this, then you might do some damage to your arm because your arm wasn't ready for it. First of all, to your point, I would say this: back to freedom before explosion.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what, whether your arm is feeling great, pretty good, not so good, if you start with the massage throwing, you're putting yourself in an optimal position to warm it up, to stretch it out, to get loose, and then to allow yourself to find out where your throwing is going to go that day. And I truly believe your throwing is going to be unbelievably optimized just by putting yourself in that position
Hmm.
by doing the massage throwing first.
Absolutely. And then just even having that freedom mindset, you're like, hey, I'm gonna move as free and loose and easy as possible. I think a lot of guys have some awesome magic happen just from having that mindset. Be like, hey, I don't need to try to be perfect and, you know, get in all these specific positions. You give them freedom. I love showing the video of you have Bauer throwing in the background and then Stroman in the front where he's just kind of shuffling around. I'm like, yeah, both of those. Right? Like you need to have both of those to be able to, allow yourself to have what's the word I'm trying to say? I guess it is of a more free mindset of how you approach throwing. If or I'm not sure if you kind of get where I'm picking up
No,
what I'm putting down, but hopefully that makes sense.
well, another word for freedom is athleticism. Another word for
Yeah.
athleticism is trusting your innate movements, right? So they all go together. Freedom, athleticism, intuition,
Yeah.
instincts. I mean, that's the other reason I love massage throwing is that, as you said, when you get into your massage, it's almost like you get into your right brain. You get more into your creativity. You get more into your feel. You get more into your proprioception. And so it's a massive deal. And I've gone out there, as I'm sure you have, and I've watched players from the get-go get loose and throw the ball with some firmness on the line. And that concerns me about the rehab programs is that they are at these shorter distances for weeks, and that they're not maybe talking about massage throwing, and they might be throwing the ball on a line a lot, and they might be in a very rigid state. And we're trying to do the opposite, whether you're going through rehab or not. We're trying
Absolutely.
to
Yeah.
free you up. I mean, look, in a way, a lot of this conversation is coming back to this word freedom. We're just trying to free you up, and that means free up your mind, free up your body, free up your athleticism, free up your intuition, free up your proprioception. And that to me is like at the core of that all starts with this idea of massage and relaxation throwing. With art, by the way, that's with art. It's hard to throw in a massage way on a line from the start.
Yeah. No, it's very true. And that was a big bone that a lot of people did have to pick with those early on return to throwing plans. It's like, hey, here's the distance, but there's no like perceived exertion level really with that, right? Like a lot of guys be like, oh, 90 feet. Okay. Here's 90, 90 feet at 90 miles an hour, right? And you're like, oh, not that, not that. We don't need that. Right. And
Well,
obviously that leads to a lot of other things. But
yeah, sorry, I mean to cut you off. I was going to add that because you just gave me another great visual, which is if you're at 90 feet, and let's say you're 3 weeks or 4 weeks away from getting to 120 feet or whatever it is, and that's your cap. You subconsciously are already, doing the math like, okay, well, then I'm getting to the mound and then I'll build up off the mound. But
mm,
so in a way, it almost that's this concerning part for us is you're going to probably start promoting way more intent at these linear shorter distances because you're only getting to 120 at some point. Again, let's say this again, 93 and a half miles an hour will go somewhere between 330 and 350, maybe whatever I think 96 miles an hour is 350, 93 might be 330, but whatever it is, if that's what's freedom and range of motion is in the arm at 30 or 40 degrees, then, and you're only going to 120 feet and you start getting to 90, 100, 110 feet, if you're on a line, I mean, you're probably going to start throwing with more and more exertion
yeah.
in a linear way because you're not that far from the end of your program at 120, which means you're going to get on a mound and start building up on a mound. The whole thing to me is just, again, I know the medical community is doing the best they can. It's just this is why we wrote the manual. It's just people need to understand that there's a whole other world waiting for you beyond 120 feet. And to me, what happens, I actually started writing an article to correspond with our manual. And the title of the article was essentially something like the missing link, what happens beyond 120 feet. And it is the missing link to the rehab program. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and like you mentioned at the beginning, was there's nuance to this, right? Like no one, and like you said, so there's orthopedic surgeons out there that are absolutely great, and they totally understand kind of some of the baseball run because they've had that in their past. But for maybe some of them that don't know about that, right? Like they don't know what they don't know. And they don't know that guys throw 360 feet long toss. They probably maybe saw it on Sports Center one time. I was like, oh wow, that guy's a freak. And then they label it off, and then they're just like, on to the next one. We're like, oh hey, this 13-year-old who just had Tommy John probably doesn't need to do that, but he was, having a lot more freedom and was probably doing a whole lot of other similar stuff to his age, but at some point he was starting to throw through pain, and then that's what kind of led to that, which is a whole nother topic, right? But I think it's important for us as the boots on the ground to convey and articulate those nuances to them, and also to the people who are going through this return to sport, return to throwing and return to sport aspect, where there's, again, that's a bone that I've had to pick a lot with too, is there's a return to throw to 100%, and then there's a return to actual sport like activity, which you guys covered really well, in the protocol, I think. And the concept that was really cool too, that I liked, that I wanted to kind of touch on, was the cool down on the mound, because there's a lot of I guess preconceived ideas. Not really sure who brought it up, but it was like, oh, you don't need to get on the mound all the time. And now it's like, actually, if you throw on the mound as a pitcher, you probably need to spend more time on the mound. Right? So
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for checking out our manual and the
oh no, it
great.
was awesome. I absolutely loved it. I'm going to recommend it to all of my guys and everyone who goes through any type of a return to throwing plan. I think it's a valuable resource.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and I know on behalf of Randy, we appreciate it. The cooling down thing is something that I learned this term about 6 years ago or so from Nate Trotsky, and I love it. It's functional training. It's something that's probably very well known out there in the training world, but I had never really heard that exact term. And when you think about cooling down off the mound, even
Yeah.
early on, it's functional training. It's like, get the body start to get used to, of course, the decline, right? And look, there's studies out there. I don't know, I can't quote a specific one, but there's studies I believe now that have shown that there's less stress on the arm, throwing off of a mound versus on flat ground. And again, without getting into throwing with full intent and breaking balls and all that stuff, but
Sure. Oh yeah.
so as a rule of thumb, yeah, I think it's again, it has to be monitored well, especially early on. But we just we felt like that ultimately, if you're going to make, because we start building the volume up pretty well after, especially after the first, I don't know, 6 to 8 weeks. And
Hmm.
at that point, we're like, we want people self-regulating. So therefore, if they come back into 60 feet or whatever it is, and they're throwing with 50% or whatever it is, lightly, um, which we don't want them at 60 feet coming in when they start the heavy pull down phases, because that's too dangerous for some of these players. But at least
For the
early
one
on,
catching it,
60
yeah.
feet, what was that?
So definitely for the one catching it from that short
Yeah, yeah,
distance.
yeah. But look, if you're at 50%, you come back to 60 feet. Our point is that, bring a catcher up to maybe 45 feet, and you can do some cool downs off the mound. And look, everything again is managing the delta.
Hmm.
Borrow a term from Randy through Dr. Marcus Elliott, which is, we don't even bring in the cool down, and that's still an option. Everything in our manual, there's a lot of options, and there are a lot of suggestions and what we feel like are really good guidelines. But even the cool down piece, I don't think comes in until they're at least at 120 feet, and they're in pretty good shape. And We know maybe they're only 4 to 6 weeks or so off away from starting to, get into their heavier pull downs, and maybe, some 70, 80, whatever the percentage is off the mount. That's when we're like, look, you're in really good shape. And according to the other manuals, at 120, they're actually ready to start getting off the mountain anyway. So,
Yeah.
we try to do a really good job, by the way, with our manual of not rocking the boat too much, meaning our first 10 weeks are probably, not probably, I know this, they're not much different than a lot of the standardized protocols out there, so we overlap in a lot of ways. It's just there's some pieces for us that are huge. We add in an extra day of throwing a lot earlier than the standardized program. We add in another day, so it's 3 days a week for 6 to 8 weeks with a lot of these programs. We add a fourth day in, I think, week 7. We had a fifth day in week 12. So we get to more throwing sooner. Obviously, it's still massage throwing, or I shouldn't say obviously, but it's still massage throwing. We work on a lot more volume over those first 10 to 12 weeks.
Which I
But
think is
yeah,
so too. Because
what was that?
I've seen some guys, Scott Richardson, who I had previously on the podcast, where he used a wearable, went through the normal traditional return to throwing, and he's like, my volume kind of just capped for a while, right? It just kind of flattened out. And like, well, how are you really progressing to get back to high intensity and then eventually higher throwing volumes, as well, especially if you're a starter, right? To go back to those 120 innings underneath your belt, like you got to increase that workload, right? And it's not even including all the other additional throws you throw on the bullpen and warming up, playing catch, right? Like there's a lot of other ones there. Um, but I love what Randy says about that too, where you mentioned the delta, right? Always look and see what changed, whether it's a rehab guy or not. I think when guys' performance tends to kind of be a little weary, you got to kind of have something to refer back to, right? And I know Ron said this a lot too, where he was just like, "Hey, I can get someone who used to throw 100 or 95 or whatever it is, and then they filtered off and then use that as a reference point to be able to see what changed, versus a guy who maybe never threw 90 before. That's a lot harder than or 100, or put it whatever marker, because things do change, right? Like injuries happen, or maybe different environments change, right? Like those things that a lot of people look a little bit too much into just the physical component, but you got to take into effect of everything, right? Like that whole uh you know triangle of organism, environment, task. And the fact that you guys also mention a lot in the plan of switching up the task, having the freedom throwing, or having throws where you're just kind of moving around and adding in that athleticism. I think that's a huge component, even for people outside of the return to throwing or rehab side of things. Like I think that's something that you need to have and value a lot, not necessarily flip the boat, right? But you don't want to be stuck and be too rigid, because that's where I think a lot of guys can get into trouble.
Yeah, I mean, that's just another piece that I feel like we've added. I mean, we've added a lot of, I think, really unique pieces to this manual compared to a lot of the standardized program. That's just another one we added, which is making throws to, you know, put 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 the athlete in a position to adapt and be athletic and work on feel, work on proprioception, move the feet a certain way, throw maybe it's slightly I don't want to get into angles, but just
Yeah.
whatever it is, because we want that, make sure the integrity of the elbow is right. But at some point, yes, we're trying to, our mentality is this: you've spent 4 months at least in four walls doing
Mm,
a lot of clinical work. You get out on a field, and your first 10 weeks is you're not much past 60 to 90 feet. You're in a very limited range. You're in a very linear state. And
right.
so for us, it's exactly what you said. We felt like that was another huge piece. It's funny, some of these pieces came later on toward the end of the manual, but that was another piece we added in, which is just athleticism and feel and movement. And, one of my favorite words I learned from Randy years and years ago is variability, right? Just create variability. The body loves freedom and variability. Like, it's not an accident that we feel good. That's why long toss to me is so great, because throwing the ball higher and higher and higher feels great. And it also feels intuitive. And then you take the flip side to it, which is these 120 linear programs, right? It's the opposite. The
Hmm.
body, in some ways, it might make some sense that you're throwing the same way and you're repeating your delivery. And I understand all that theory. Um, the body doesn't like it. The body likes diversity. The body likes creativity, right? So that's the other beauty of long toss, and the other reason why, again, we feel like this, what happens beyond that 120 feet. Not that we don't want more massage and arc throwing there too. Of course we do. But we know from 120 on, you're gonna get forced now into throwing it higher and higher and higher and higher. And
It's
that's
changing
what,
everything. Absolutely.
yeah.
Changing that task. I, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. I'm sure you've probably ran into this before. Um, and again, kind of coming from my personal experience where I was chasing the one metric of like, I got to get to 340 because that's like the next velo jump for me, right? So then I get so many throws and then I would get stuck here. And then that did result onto the mound whenever I got back to that. Um, how do you handle guys that maybe are kind of into those patterns where they're chasing that metric and then it starts to result where they have like this super uphill tilt with their shoulders? How would you go into maybe, and again, not getting too specific, or maybe you can't get really specific, but how would you get them to change, like we were talking about, to get them to get out of that either performance rut or maybe coming back from rehab, they're having a hard time adjusting from the long toss and flat ground to back onto the mound, which I think the cool down throwing will help with that. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, one of the coolest things of seeing someone get out to their max distance and starting to get a lot of tilt is I always knew, and I did it myself. And so luckily I had the experience and the feel of it. And then I had years and years of experience watching guys learn it, learn how to do it. The problem is that the higher you go, is that if someone is not there with you or you don't know to do this, it's tricky to pull down correctly, because what happens is that as you throw the ball higher and higher uphill, you can say theoretically you have more layback, right? But to me, the higher you throw it in a way, the more benefits you're getting, because you're getting a better glute load, hip load, you're getting a better pelvic tilt. I think hinge is a popular term out there that I think kind of goes hand in hand with the pelvic tilt. And also, look, what goes up must come down. So the higher you go in a way, I look at it like angles, range of motion. So the higher you go up this way, well, that means the more you can go down, and
Yeah,
the more leverage you can build because of it. So the real answer is this: it's not about the uphill issue. It's about, does someone have an awareness, or does someone know that on the way down is that they have to start figuring out how to aim lower and lower on the way down. So we used to play a game with our players, and it took them a while to figure this out. When I say a while, it might be a session or two. Sometimes within the session, they would definitely start to get it. But it is an art form, and the art form is as follows. And I've had this question come up a million times from people that have said, I'm out to 350, but I'm only throwing 88 off the mound.
right.
And I've given them the answer, and I think it's 100% as far as their response is like, oh, that makes sense. Yes, I'm not doing that. And here's what they're not doing. Um, if you, let's call it X. If you're, let's use an extreme number like 400 feet to really drive this point home.
Sure.
So let's say you're at 400 feet, which means you had to go like 45 degrees uphill, which is a ton, right? We'll say you use X amount of effort or intent to throw it that far. That's your best bolt, okay? Well, as you come back in, and we can skip from 400 to 300 to 200, let's just cut to the chase. Um, but anyways, our players come in from their furthest distance. What happens is that you reverse engineer it. So at 380 feet, instead of 45 degrees, you might be 43 degrees. And at 250, you might be at 31 degrees, right? And at 164, you might be at 17 degrees. But if you're doing this correctly and you're maintaining X, it's all math. Now, this is something that athletes will tend to feel incredibly quickly, which to me shows you how mystical and magical, again, our bodies are and our feel is. The point is this: most athletes will come in from these massive distances and they'll do what we call decelerate.
Hmm.
They will not maintain X. And I'm not saying you have to maintain X from 400 to, let's say, 200, but let's say from 200 and in, if you're really working on pull downs and athleticism and leverage and all this good stuff, you sort of need to maintain the X, and you really need to maintain it for sure 120 and in.
Right.
But what happens is athletes get used to decelerating on the way in because they don't want to play chase all day. They don't want to throw the ball over their partner's head. That doesn't look good. We know intuitively that we're playing catch, so we want to hit our partner in the chest per se, right? Give or take. And so we subconsciously figure out ways to ease up and get the ball to our partner. Now, you can still make an 80% pull down and it's got plenty of life on it, but it's not a true pull down because you're not really maintaining X. So I'm going to finish this. So the story's going to make more sense here in a second. We're getting to the end now. So what I want you to imagine now, and we won't do this with the player because it's too dangerous, but this is a way to prove this point. Let's imagine that we had a fence with a catcher's glove. So there's no human being there. And I'm
Right.
going to bring you into 40 feet just to prove this point. And if I were to say to you, Garrison, that you were just at 400 feet, you could say you were as uphill as you can be, and someone might say that's too uphill, but let's just go with it for a second. And now we progressively pulled you down, but let's just cut to the 40 feet now. And you're still throwing 100% of that X, not 94, not 89, but you are maintaining 100% of X, which is, again, your furthest distance, 400 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And now you're able to take that 400 feet, and here's a word from Brent Strum, compress. You're able to compress that distance to where the glove, by the way, is at the bottom of the fence, where the bar is at the very bottom, at where it touches the dirt on a field. And you're able to get the ball down to the glove, basically at ground height, 400 feet compressed. That was 45 degrees uphill. You have figured out a way to go, whatever that would be, minus 20 degrees
Mm-hmm.
the other way. Oh, by the way, you just got 65 degrees of leverage. And you were able to pull this off. Now, by the way, here's a side note. How good do your mechanics have to be to pull it off? Here's the second thing. How free do you have to be physically and mentally to pull it off? But back to the original question is, now what kind of life, leverage, and explosiveness are you going to get on the ball? Because you knew that you had to maintain 100% of X to pull this off. And that's the disconnect. That's sort of what you don't know what you don't know, as you said earlier. And so the fix is not in that I'm going too high, even though that might look like an easy fix. It's
Yeah.
like, well, your angle's too high and it's throwing your release point off. And I understand that. And yes, maybe early on there's some truth to that. But in the long run, these are all benefits. Like, that's the beauty of going out further and throwing it higher, is that it eventually leads to you what I would call your most optimal throw if you're doing it correctly. And so that to me is really a really cool piece about long toss, and how that uphill angle, as extreme as it can get, actually translates into major like game-changing positives on the way back in.
Absolutely. No, I love that. That's really cool. I like how you kind of broke all that down with the angles and everything. It makes, like you said, makes total sense whenever you break it down that way. That's awesome.
Well, because I've lived this for whatever, 34 years, I lived it as a player. I've watched this transition from players that weren't quite able to pull down well, but got out really far. And I've seen some of the coolest things. I mean, when you watch baseball, you can say there are so many cool things, whether it's throwing, whether it's somebody hitting a Mark McGwire 500-foot home run, someone throwing somebody out at the plate with a great throw, someone making a diving play. I mean, a great changeup. There's so much beauty in baseball, as we all know. That's why we love it, the sport. Some of the most beautiful moments in my life, not even in a game situation, have been when I've seen a player click and get the pull down, maintaining the X, and having the ball end up shin high or lower on their throwing partner, and taking that massive distance and that massive angle and learning how to translate that into a true pull down. The life and explosion on the ball, which nowadays they call that vertical break, is mind blowing, and it's just a work of art. And so yeah, in a way, I'm really glad you brought that question up, because as you can see, there are so many nuances to the beauty of why the angle up can produce such a different level of benefit on the way back in.
That's it. And you can even just take that concept outside of long toss, just loving up and coming back in, bringing it all home to whatever it is you're trying to accomplish in any goal, right? You got to keep the main thing, but if you're missing that target, you got to make adjustments and be able to adjust whatever environment that you're in. So it's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, man. I love talking about pull downs and really what this all has to do with going uphill and why going uphill. I mean, look, I've spent so many years. Fortunately, a lot of times it's just informing, but I've had a lot of debates with players. I remember, with some of the major league teams that were really into the linear 120 mechanically set approach. That's dealing with an organization philosophy. And we've had my partner Jim and I, we've had some incredible meetings with some teams where we've actually done the long toss demonstration ourselves first, and then we've explained it. And I think there's an aha moment that people get when they see it, because they realize that, because look, I get it on some level that it makes sense. If you throw the ball on a line all day long, you're going to quote unquote repeat your release point. It's just like there's this whole other world waiting for you, though, by going uphill and then downhill. And I would still argue this based on, again, a term I got from Randy a long time ago: variability, which is adaptability, which is feel, which is proprioception.
That's it.
You're way more accurate as a result of not throwing the ball on a line all day. And then you get the benefits of health, conditioning, endurance, velocity, life, recovery. I mean, anyway, that you can see why I'm very passionate about this idea of not throwing the ball on a line and not capping players at whatever distance, but especially 120 feet.
No, I'm right behind you. I'm totally with you on that. I love it. I love it. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Do you have any other closing remarks for people before I let you go? And I really, again, this was an awesome treat to have you on here.
Oh, no, listen, man, thank you for having me on. And I know on behalf of Randy that we're just grateful for people like yourself who have really taken an interest and care about getting the word out. And no, and I just would say this, that I feel very fortunate that Randy, um, that we collaborated together. He has been an incredible teacher for me, and he's just brilliant, as you know, when it comes to the anatomy and biomechanics and science and feel, the pitching and throwing side. Um, and no, just so people know, our manual is free. All they have to do is go to our website or the Florida Armory, Florida
Yeah.
Armory's website.
I'll put
It's
the link in the show notes for you guys that are listening as well. Yeah, absolutely.
No, it's perfect. And the only thing I'd add to it is, just because I love the name of your podcast, is that my other big passion and what I really started out in baseball was in the mental game. And so just for anybody out there that's interested in anything to do with the mental game, We have so many free resources on our website at jagersports.com and on YouTube. And so just know that we have a ton of resources there available as well.
Love it. Yeah, I'll definitely share those, and appreciate you all listening in, and stay in the zone.